Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been interested in reptiles and amphibians for as long as I can remember. As a kid, I loved bringing home lizards and frogs, though my parents thought it was just a phase. But my passion only grew. By my 20s, I had a collection of tree frogs, bearded dragons, and a few rescued geckos. I didn't just keep them. I learned about their behaviors, studied their habitats, and even started breeding them. The thing about being a reptile enthusiast is that you also become an expert in keeping insects. Most reptiles eat insects, so you need to know how to maintain healthy bug colonies to feed them. Over the years, I got pretty good at it, especially with ants. They're fascinating creatures, and their colonies make perfect food sources for certain species of frogs. Life has a way of changing your plans, though. I had to downsize when I moved to a smaller apartment in the city for work. Couldn't keep my larger terrariums anymore, which meant saying goodbye to most of my scaled and amphibian friends. But I didn't want to give up my hobby entirely, so I adapted. I started focusing on ant colonies. They're perfect for small spaces, and I could still practice my terrarium building skills on a miniature scale. I already had 3 queen ants at home. One Lasius marginatus I caught 2 years ago, and I was excited to spot 2 Camponotus queens while out shopping. That's where my trouble started. I was taking a smoke break on a bench near a park when I noticed them. 2 wingless queen ants searching for nesting sites after their mating flight. It was a rare find, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity. The only container I had on hand was a clear plastic wrapping from my cigarette packs. I carefully caught each queen and stored them separately in the plastic. I knew I needed to get them proper housing quickly. Queen ants need specific conditions to start their colonies, and those temporary plastic wrappings wouldn't cut it. The pharmacy was just around the corner, and they sold exactly what I needed: test tubes for blood samples, which make perfect starter homes for ant colonies, and some cotton for water storage and ventilation. That's when everything went sideways. As soon as I stepped out of the pharmacy, 2 police officers were waiting for me. One tall, one short, both wearing those typical "I've got you now" smirks. The tall officer started questioning me about why I'd bought cotton and needles, assuming the test tube boxes contained syringes. I tried explaining my situation, telling them about being a reptile and amphibian enthusiast and how I'd just caught 2 queen ants, which was perfectly legal. I even mentioned that I needed the supplies to house them properly. The short officer just laughed and told his partner it was the lamest excuse he'd ever heard from a junkie. That comment made me angry, so I sarcastically asked if he was speaking from experience with junkie excuses. The tall officer didn't appreciate my attempt at humor and asked if I was trying to be funny. I responded that with all the cop jokes out there, I'd expected them to have a sense of humor. The situation escalated when the short officer accused me of calling them idiots and threatened to add insulting officers to my drug charges. At that point, I decided to lay out everything clearly. I showed them the plastic wraps containing the queen ants, explained these weren't drugs, and demonstrated that I'd bought test tubes, not needles. I told them they could search my backpack and pockets, but I'd be calling my lawyer first, mentioning that she loves handling police harassment cases. The mention of a lawyer changed their whole demeanor. The tall officer started actually looking at the plastic wraps and finally noticed the ants. The short one tried maintaining his tough attitude, but I could tell he was getting nervous. They asked for my ID, which I provided while making it obvious I was pulling up my lawyer's contact information. They huddled together, whispering and looking at me occasionally. When they finally returned my ID, the short officer tried to save face by warning me about suspicious behavior being investigated. I couldn't resist one final jab reminding them that harassment can lead to formal complaints. I even offered to explain why these particular queen ants were so special, but the tall officer quickly declined and said they had to leave. They tried to walk away looking dignified, but I heard the short one complaining about smart A bug collectors under his breath. I waited until they were gone before setting up my new queen ants in their proper test tube homes. It wasn't the afternoon I had planned, but at least I got 2 new colonies out of it, in a story that never fails to get laughs at reptile enthusiast meetups. I work in tech, traveling across America providing specialized on-site support. The job pays well but requires extensive travel, around 100,000 miles a year by car. During summer, my family joins me, turning work trips into amazing vacations across America, Canada, and Mexico. However, winter means solo trips lasting anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months while the kids are in school. This story takes place during one of my extended trips away, leaving my wife to handle things at home. When we first moved into our house, we had wonderful neighbors across the street, a Latino family who owned a bar. They were respectful, kept their property beautiful, and even installed an elegant wrought iron fence. Unfortunately, they faced monthly police harassment due to prejudiced assumptions about their success. Despite never finding anything illegal, the police would regularly search their house and cars. Eventually, they got fed up, sold everything, and moved to a more welcoming community. After they left, the house saw a revolving door of tenants until this one guy moved in. Let's call him Mr. Entitled. From day one, he acted like he owned not just the house, but the entire street. He'd strut around in flashy clothes and jewelry, treating everyone like his subjects. The problem started immediately. His family would constantly park in our driveway or block our mailbox, preventing mail delivery. My wife would return from school runs to find she couldn't park in our own driveway. Leaving notes on windshields did nothing. They'd take our spot whenever they could. Weekends were worse. The street would be packed with their visitors' cars, and they'd blast music so loud our windows shook until 4 or 5 a.m. Mr. Entitled had intimidated the neighbors into not complaining, and when we called the police about the noise, they'd turn it up even louder after the officers left. One day, my wife came home from picking up our kids to find Mr. Entitled's niece parked in our driveway. My wife politely asked the niece to move her car, explaining that she had no permission to park on our property. The niece responded rudely, claiming her uncle had given her permission to park there and told my wife to get lost. My wife tried to explain that her uncle couldn't give permission to use someone else's property, but the niece just repeated that her uncle said she could park there, so she would. She then got out, locked her car, and started walking away. When my wife warned about having the car towed, the niece just smugly replied that my wife wouldn't dare. Knowing this might escalate, my wife called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher's reaction was telling. The moment my wife gave our address, they simply said, "Oh, them." While my wife was looking for a towing company, Mr. Entitled showed up at our door, fuming. He started yelling about how dare my wife tell his niece she couldn't park there when he had given permission. My wife explained that he had no authority to give anyone permission to use our property. This made him even angrier, and he tried to intimidate her by puffing up his chest and telling her she didn't know who she was dealing with, insisting that his word was law. My wife, unimpressed, mocked his macho attitude. She told him that where she came from, men were afraid of women, not the other way around, and even joked about having a marble rolling pin ready. This really set him off. He started sputtering incoherently about how nobody talks to him that way. When he raised his fist to strike my wife, she noticed a police car pulling up behind his niece's car. Instead of defending herself, which she was ready to do, she decided to play the victim and cowered slightly. Before his fist could come down, the officer had already vaulted over his car and our fence, grabbing Mr. Entitled's arm. Within moments, he was in handcuffs in the back of a police car. My wife played up being a scared woman, alone with her kids while her husband was away for work. The niece was forced to move her car and Mr. Entitled disappeared for about a week. Apparently, there were some additional legal complications the police couldn't discuss. After that incident, Mr. Entitled never acknowledged our existence again. More importantly, none of his people ever parked in our driveway or blocked our mailbox. We had just one more late-night music party, but a single police complaint shut that down permanently. The house fell into disrepair under his ownership. He clearly wasn't interested in maintaining it. He eventually sold it, probably to go run down another property somewhere else. but at least we got our driveway back and some peace and quiet. This story happened to my dad back in 1995, and it still makes us laugh whenever we talk about it. My dad was, and still is, the type of guy who always finds clever solutions to ridiculous problems, especially when dealing with bureaucracy. He owned a small accounting firm at the time, so numbers were his thing, and he knew every loophole in the book. That one day, he was heading home after a long meeting with a client. He was tired and admittedly rolled through a stop sign. Not his proudest moment, but hey, we all make mistakes. A police officer pulled him over almost immediately. The officer approached his window with that typical, "I caught you" smirk. He asked my dad for his license and registration, which my dad handed over without argument. The officer then asked if my dad knew why he'd been pulled over. My dad admitted that he hadn't come to a complete stop and apologized for it. The officer told him it would be a $20 fine. My dad, being practical, immediately reached for his wallet to pay the fine on the spot. But the officer's attitude changed completely when he saw my dad trying to handle it efficiently. The officer smugly told him that they didn't take cash payments anymore, and that my dad would have to transfer it through his bank. Now, for younger folks, this might not sound like a big deal, but in 1995 this meant physically going to the bank, waiting in line, and filling out transfer forms by hand. The officer was clearly doing this just to inconvenience my dad. My dad asked if the officer was sure about this, mentioning he had the exact amount right there. The officer just repeated that those were the rules and told him he'd receive the payment information in the mail. My dad, being an accountant, knew exactly how the banking system worked. When he received the payment slip a few days later, he did some quick math. The bank transfer fee was 19 cents, so he transferred exactly $19.81. You see, he figured if they wouldn't take his cash payment, he shouldn't have to pay the transfer fee. The money came back automatically because their system could only process the exact amount of $20. A week later, he received a payment reminder. He wrote back explaining that he had already attempted payment, minus the transfer fee since they refused his cash. This time he sent $19.14, subtracting 2 transfer fees since the first payment was returned, and the cost of the stamp for his reply letter. Once again, the system rejected it. When the next reminder came, it was getting a bit ridiculous. Luckily, my dad's best friend from college was a lawyer who found this whole situation hilarious. He wrote an official letter explaining why my dad was legally justified in deducting these fees, citing specific regulations about reasonable payment methods and additional costs incurred due to bureaucratic requirements. My dad's final transfer was for just under $18, accounting for all the accumulated fees and postage. The system rejected it again, but something interesting happened. A junior officer from the department called my dad's lawyer. The junior officer explained that this had become a huge headache for them. He mentioned that their software couldn't handle custom amounts, and updating it would cost thousands. He also admitted that my dad's legal argument actually made sense. When the lawyer asked what they were suggesting, the junior officer said they were dropping it but pleaded with them not to tell anyone about this loophole. They never pursued the fine again. The officer who started all this got a reputation at the department for creating unnecessary paperwork. Apparently, his supervisor made him handle all the back and forth manually, which meant hours of extra work for him. The department actually issued an internal memo requiring officers to accept cash payments for minor traffic violations when offered. The petty officer's attempt to create extra work for my dad ended up creating a mountain of paperwork for himself and changing department policy. That $20 fine probably cost the department hundreds in administrative hours, and my dad only spent about 10 minutes doing calculations, which, being an accountant, he actually enjoyed. Back in 1995, I was working at a promising tech startup, and with 2 young daughters, aged 3 and 5, plus my wife, who'd chosen to be a full-time mom, I felt it was time to get serious about life insurance. You know, just in case something happened to any of us. Being smart with money has always been important to me. Coming from a middle-class family, I grew up understanding the need to plan ahead. My parents worked hard, not struggling, but not wealthy either, and they made sure I knew how important financial security was. So when my wife and I started a family, making sure we were financially protected became a top priority. I reached out to this insurance agent who came highly recommended by a colleague. He seemed professional enough during our first meeting at his fancy downtown office. During our meeting, he explained that based on my family situation, he recommended getting policies for all four of us. He emphasized that the rates for children were quite affordable at that time. I agreed with him, telling him I wanted to make sure everyone was covered. The agent went through all the paperwork with me, and I filled out applications for everyone. Then began the waiting game. 3 weeks later, 3 policies arrived in the mail, one each for my wife and daughters. Mine was conspicuously absent. During this time, I called the office several times to check on the status of my policy, but his secretary kept giving me the runaround, saying it was still being processed by the underwriters. 2 more weeks passed before my policy finally showed up. When I opened it, I nearly choked on my coffee. They wanted to charge me $99 per month instead of the quoted $24. I immediately called the agent. When I asked about why my premium was more than 4 times what we discussed, he explained that according to their underwriters, I'd been flagged as high risk due to my driving record. He mentioned I'd had several speeding tickets, though I noticed he seemed uncomfortable delivering this news. I responded sarcastically, asking if he was really telling me that my tendency to drive 5 miles over the speed limit somehow affected my mortality rate. He started going on about how statistics showed that individuals with multiple traffic violations had a higher risk factor, insisting it was all about the numbers. I could tell from his voice that he was reading from a script, probably something the insurance company made him memorize for situations like this. I told him I'd done my own math, and these odds didn't add up. He brushed it off, reminding me that I had 30 days to think about it, and pointed out that at least my family was already protected with their policies. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, as if he thought he had me cornered. That's when I saw my opportunity. I explained to him that since they determined I was such a high risk due to my driving, I should probably mention that these 3 people they just insured spent most of their time in the car with me behind the wheel. I added that I'd hate for his company to take on that kind of liability, considering how dangerous I apparently was. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. The agent went quiet for a moment before stammering that he'd need to consult with their underwriter about this and would get back to me. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head as he realized the hole in their logic. 2 days later, my phone rang. The agent called to tell me that after reviewing my case, they'd noticed that one of the tickets would be off my record in 3 months. He said that, in light of this, they'd decided to approve me at the standard rate. I responded with a dry comment about how remarkably convenient that was. His nervous laughter told me everything I needed to know about how they operated. I signed the policy at the original rate, but I made sure to start shopping around for a new insurance company right after. Found one that didn't play these games and switched all our policies over as soon as the contract allowed. That agent's office closed down a few years later. A former employee later told me that their practices had finally caught up with them. The State Insurance Commission had received so many complaints about their predatory pricing practices that they launched an investigation. The company tried to blame everything on rogue agents, but the evidence showed a clear pattern of systematic overcharging. They ended up facing hefty fines and losing their license to operate in the state. I sometimes wonder if my case was one of the ones that made it into the investigation files. Either way, it was satisfying to know that their attempts to exploit people's fears for profit finally caught up with them. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.